them all what I'm made up. Strut down the hall, won't stop till I get enough.
You know, it's funny how in international relations, sometimes like the most routine travel plan can suddenly turn into like this huge diplomatic headache.
Yeah.
And, you know, you recently sent me some articles about this situation with the planned U.S. delegation visit to Greenland. And wow, the reaction from Denmark and Greenland was really something.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
on the surface, it seemed like a pretty straightforward diplomatic engagement.
Right.
But very quickly, it revealed some fascinating historical layers and political sensitivities that are really at play in this strategically important part of the world.
For sure. And, you know, that's what we're going to try to do in this deep dive today.
Absolutely.
We're going to go beyond those initial headlines and really try to unpack, you know, what these reactions tell us about the dynamics between these key players.
Yeah, exactly.
So from the articles you sent me, it seems like the initial plan involved Usha Vance, the wife of U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance.
Right?
And she was going to visit this really popular dog-sled race in Greenland.
Mm.
Now, just on the face of it, that sounds like a pretty normal cultural visit, right?
Yeah, you would think so.
But it seems like it immediately raised a lot of concerns over in Copenhagen.
You know, it's really interesting. What's so fascinating is how strong and how immediate that reaction from Denmark was.
Yeah.
I mean, Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen called the visit unacceptable pressure.
Wow.
And she didn't really mince words there.
Mm-hmm.
And to understand why this seemingly harmless visit caused such a strong reaction, you really have to consider the history.
Yeah.
I mean, Greenland, while it enjoys a lot of self-rule as a constituent country within the Kingdom of Denmark,
Right.
it has a long history of being under Danish rule.
Right.
And this makes any talk of taking over or undue influence from outside a really, really sensitive topic
Yeah.
for both Greenlanders and Denmark.
Yeah.
So, you know, we can't forget that President Trump was very public about his interest in, well, exploring the possibility of the U.S. acquiring Greenland.
Right.
And that casts a really long shadow over any interaction between the U.S. and the territory.
Right. So that sentiment, Greenland is not for sale, is still very much alive. It seems like with that initial plan with Usha Vance going to the dog-sled race, that really touched a nerve.
For sure.
But then the sources mention a shift in these plans.
Yeah.
What exactly changed after that initial reaction from Denmark?
What seems like the White House maybe sensed that diplomatic friction, and they announced a change in the delegation.
Okay.
So Vice President J.D. Vance himself would now lead the group.
Got it.
But, importantly, the visit would be limited to the U.S. space base at Pacific in northern Greenland.
Okay.
And they canceled the planned visit to the dog-sled race.
Interesting. So kind of narrowing the focus.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
The official reason, according to a White House spokesperson, was to learn about Greenland, its culture, history, and people,
right.
but all within the confines of that existing U.S. military facility.
Okay. So how did Denmark respond to this new itinerary?
Well, their tone totally changed.
Okay.
The Danish Foreign Minister, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, said very explicitly that this was a clear de-escalation. And he also said it was very positive that the Americans had decided not to visit Greenlandic society, and that Denmark had nothing against a visit to the existing U.S. base.
So it sounds like what they were really concerned about wasn't necessarily a U.S. presence in Greenland,
Right.
but more about the U.S. appearing to like sidestep them and directly engage with Greenland?
Yeah, it's all about respecting those established diplomatic channels that go through Copenhagen.
Right, so like a protocol thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So let's turn our attention now to Greenland. What were their reactions to all of this?
This is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
And this is where we see, I think, the most significant underlying tensions.
Okay.
The articles you sent paint a very clear picture of just how strongly Greenlanders oppose the idea of becoming part of the United States.
Yeah.
Polls show nearly unanimous disapproval.
Wow.
And this isn't just like quiet disagreement either.
Right.
There were some of the biggest anti-American protests ever seen in Greenland recently.
Right.
People were holding signs saying things like, "Make America go away" and "Yankees go home."
Wow. So
Yeah.
they were not subtle.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And reportedly, there were similar protests being planned for the Vance visit.
Make America go away. That's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just the Danish government that had some issues with this.
Right.
The people of Greenland themselves were feeling very uneasy about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And even a Greenlandic member of the Danish parliament called the initial visit chaotic and disrespectful,
Wow.
and said that the U.S. had really misread the mood in Greenland.
So this wasn't just like a government-to-government issue.
No, not at all.
It really tapped into a much deeper feeling of national identity.
Exactly.
And a desire for self-determination within Greenland.
Yeah, and a professor at the University of Copenhagen talked about how there are these widespread concerns in Greenland about what they see as a soft power operation and creeping American infiltration. And a lot of Greenlanders view that as a direct threat to their autonomy.
Right. So it's interesting that this professor also said that the credit for the positive turn in the plans should go to Greenland itself.
Correct.
Like they were acknowledging the power of those planned protests.
Absolutely.
So it seems like Copenhagen was also relieved when the plans changed.
Yeah, an associate professor at the Royal Danish Defense College said that Copenhagen was relieved that the visit would no longer involve those direct interactions with Greenlandic society.
Interesting. So it sounds like Denmark and at least a big part of the Greenlandic population agree that the U.S.'s engagement with Greenland needs to be very carefully managed.
For sure.
Now, one thing that I found really interesting in the articles was that the organizers of that dog-sled race, they had said that they had actually gotten grants from the American consulate in Nuuk.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. How do you think that detail fits into this bigger picture of, all these diplomatic sensitivities?
Well, on the one hand, you can see it as pretty normal diplomatic outreach,
right.
Supporting local cultural events, trying to foster some goodwill.
Right.
But especially considering those past tensions and, Trump's rhetoric, this kind of engagement could definitely be seen by some as, another example of that creeping infiltration.
Right.
Like an attempt by the U.S. to build influence within Greenland through these non-governmental channels. It really shows how carefully the U.S. has to act diplomatically in this region.
Yeah.
Because even seemingly harmless actions can be viewed with a lot of suspicion.
Right. And then on top of all of that, we have the fact that Donald Trump Jr. made a private visit earlier this year to this mineral-rich island.
Yeah. And since that visit, Trump has consistently talked about annexing Greenland. And that can't be helping to ease any of those anxieties.
Definitely not. So let's talk about the military side of things. The articles mentioned that 2 U.S. Hercules military transport planes arrived and then later departed.
Right.
And they were carrying bulletproof vehicles. And, of course, Greenland is extremely strategically important for the U.S. military.
Oh, absolutely. Especially for its ballistic missile early warning system.
Right.
Because geographically, it's located right between Europe and North America.
Right. So how do you think this whole military dimension plays into this delicate diplomatic situation that we're seeing?
Well, I think the military dimension is really key to understanding all of this.
Okay.
As you said, Greenland's location makes it incredibly important for U.S. security interests.
Yeah.
And we can't forget about that 1951 agreement.
Right.
Which gives the U.S. the right to operate and even build military bases in Greenland.
Right.
Although they do have to notify Denmark.
Right.
So you can see that there's this longstanding strategic partnership.
Right.
But at the same time, when you have these military planes with specialized vehicles arriving.
Right.
Especially at a time when there's this potentially sensitive diplomatic visit.
Yeah.
Well, it can definitely be interpreted in a lot of ways. And it might have unintentionally made people feel like there was undue pressure being applied.
Right.
Which would further fuel those negative reactions.
Right. It's kind of a reminder of that power dynamic that exists in this relationship.
For sure.
Then we have the acting head of government of Greenland who described that initial planned visit as a provocation.
Yeah.
Especially considering that there were already government coalition talks happening and local elections coming up in Greenland. So it seems like internal Greenlandic politics also play a big role in this whole situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The timing of that initial visit was definitely very sensitive.
Yeah.
And both the Danish Prime Minister and Greenland's Prime Minister, Mute Arid, have been very clear that Greenland has the right to decide its own future and that it's not for sale.
Right. So this goes back to what we were talking about before.
Yeah.
That desire for self-determination.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that resistance to any pressure from outside.
Yeah.
So it seems like this whole thing with the U.S. delegation visiting Greenland sparked a lot of diplomatic tension because of a bunch of different factors.
Right.
Like the history, especially Trump's past comments about wanting to acquire Greenland, a perceived lack of respect for Greenland's autonomy and Denmark's role in their relationship.
Yeah.
And that really strong desire for self-determination within Greenland itself.
For sure.
And then that revised plan, which narrowed the visit down to just the U.S. military base.
Right.
Well, that was welcomed by Denmark.
Yeah,
And it probably helped avoid some pretty big public protests in Greenland.
absolutely.
So this whole thing is a great example of how complicated international relations can be,
It really is.
especially when you're dealing with territories that have these complex political statuses
Right.
and really strong national identities.
It's a balancing act.
And it also reminds us how much past actions and statements by these influential figures can shape perceptions and influence reactions. So it makes you wonder how this whole dynamic is going to play out in the future.
Yeah.
You know, with Greenland's strategic importance in the Arctic and the strong desire for self-determination from its people.
Right.
How's all of this going to evolve as the Arctic region becomes even more geopolitically important?
Yeah, what are those long-term implications as all these global powers are increasingly focused on that part of the world?
It's definitely a lot to think about.
A lot to think about.
Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
You're very welcome.
It was really interesting.
It was my pleasure.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're Bobby dog. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.